That in Florida I was making 120, 150 grand. And I was on top of the world. I was a king. I mean, I was God there. Governors would come to me to get elected.
Every great professional wrestler came through Florida. Every world's champion. I mean, a lot of times world's champions didn't necessarily want to go to Alabama or want to go to Tennessee or want to go to someplace, but everybody wanted to come to Florida.
It was phenomenal business to run within an area that small. And whenever I'm talking about small geographically, where your furthest trip was 280 miles, you know, to Miami, that wasn't a bad doggone deal. So, and you're there making great money. You've got the best fishing in the world. You've got everything, you know.
Hi, I'm Gordon Sola, your host on Championship Wrestling from Florida, seen each week on this channel. And now we've got a Pier Sixer going on. The referee trying to break it up.
I'm introducing from Oklahoma, weighing 231 pounds, Jerry Briscoe.
I've never seen anything like this before.
You want some trouble? I'll show you how I got a reputation like I got, being crazy.
I have worn the gold. I know what it's like to wear the gold.
When there's a debt that needs to be collected, a lot of times you have to go to certain extremes to get that debt collected.
Championship Wrestling for Florida, in my estimation, was the roadmap of what the wrestling business had evolved to. They were ahead of their time. They had talent that could go with anybody.
It was good. You know, it was damn good.
There was just something so special about Florida Championship Wrestling. I miss those days.
I think a lot of guys went there and worked because it was Florida, and they weren't there to be around Eddie Graham. That was part of it too.
I get jealous of people that were raised in Florida because they had it, because you got to see Dusty, you got to see Kevin Sullivan.
It was the most successful wrestling company of all times.
One of the true meccas in professional wrestling, the Sunshine State offered first-class wrestling like no other territory in its prime. Championship Wrestling from Florida was one of the unquestionable leaders in the field of professional wrestling, led by perhaps the smartest man of that era in Eddie Graham, and voiced by the most recognized public figure in the country, Gordon Sola. Championship Wrestling from Florida was a destination not only for fans but for every top wrestling talent in the world. Eddie Graham not only created superstars and world champions, such as the All-American Jack Briscoe, his genius also allowed the son of a plumber, Dusty Rhodes, to create a phenomenon known as the American Dream. From ruthless villains to superheroes to innovative storylines and finishes, Championship Wrestling from Florida set the standard for how a territory should be operated. This is the story of Championship Wrestling from Florida.
Professional wrestling in the state of Florida goes back to the turn of the century. There were different promoters. There was George Romanoff in Jacksonville for many years, but Cowboy Luttrell came down to Florida in the 1940s and kind of began and started the genesis of CWF.
Cowboy was just what the name implies, is one of those old Florida crackers. I think he's originally from Georgia, that moved down here, but he's an old country boy.
Cowboy Luttrell was
In those days, I would say he was a villain. You know, he was a burly, big, tough, raw-boned guy, and he was known all over the country, and this is before TV, you know, they would promote in a different way, newspapers, and Cowboy was on top back in those days of Ed Strangle Lewis, and Luthez was just starting.
He was a guy that was real famous. He had been a wrestler, had a match with Jack Dempsey, which was boxer versus wrestler.
The interesting thing about Cowboy is he had the first, what we call now, MMA fight.
Got in the ring and a wrestler-boxer match against Jack Dempsey and got the living hell beat out of him.
And they drew about, I'm going to say 15,000 people when Atlanta wasn't, you know, 500,000 people, probably 300. And they shot. Dempsey knocked him out, knocked him through the ropes and busted his jaw. So Luttrell retired, went off to the sunset. He made a couple of good paydays. He was a smart guy, invested in Florida.
Cowboy Luttrell, at that point, his in-ring career was pretty much over, and he was looking at promoting. And he got involved in the state of Florida, still did some wrestling, but he wound up promoting. And he wound up taking over Tampa and taking over other cities. And by the 1960s, CWF had been formed, and it was Championship Wrestling from Florida.
All I can tell you is Cowboy Luttrell walked with a cane and had one eye that went this way.
Cowboy had a vision, and I think that was part of what made the territory so successful, was Cowboy had a vision of how he was going to do things. And in bringing in guys like Eddie Graham, who he had complete trust and faith in.
Well, he was Dr. Jerry Graham's partner in New York. Those guys were punch, kick, stomp, bleed, but in the end, box office attractions.
When I was growing up, Eddie and Jerry Graham were a ruthless tag team.
He was a villain. He was bad to the bone. He and Dr. Jerry Graham was wrestling Don Curtis and Mark Lewin and all the good guys that were in New York. And he was, you know, they had the sequin gowns and bleach blonde hair, and he came from wrestling in Amarillo, where violence and tough guy status was very important. And when he hit New York, it was like a hurricane.
When I first broke in the business, they were the hot team in New York, and they were the top villain team, and they were very successful. They did very well. I don't know how long they had been together, and when I got in there, I don't think they stayed together all that long, because Eddie, I think, was already working towards that deal down Florida where he was going to get into the promotion end of it.
When Eddie came in the early 60s, he had a chance to break in with Cowboy. Cowboy offered him a deal, and I got the story from Eddie that he wasn't sure if he was going to go because he was making so much money in New York at the time, ridiculous amount of money. Well, Eddie went to Florida, and he did what I said. He laid out the plan, and him and Cowboy became partners.
When he first appeared in the state of Florida, he was in as a heel as Eddie Gossett. And he wound up switching his name to Eddie Graham, which at that point, Eddie Gossett being his real name, but Eddie Graham was what he was known as. People, you know, and a lot of that notoriety coming from Madison Square Garden and the riots and things like that. So he really, the Graham name was really, really well known at that point. So when he first came into the state of Florida, he was a heel. He was working strictly as a heel, was one of the top heels in the state. And it kind of inexplicably, because he was so entrenched now in the state of Florida and working with Cowboy, the decision was made to turn him babyface. And I don't think there was an official angle or anything like that. It just kind of one day, Eddie Gossett, the hated heel, became Eddie Graham, the top star babyface.
To me, Championship Wrestling from Florida was a dream. When I grew up here, I saw the 70s wrestling when I was a kid. And of course, Eddie Graham and the Great Malenko were the first big headliners.
So the biggest feud in the history of CWF, and that was the Great Malenko versus Eddie Graham. And this was a feud that went on for years. They would wrestle for a year, they would take a break. Maybe Malenko would go to another territory, or they would feud with somebody else. But these two were like magnets because they would always get back into this feud. This is considered the feud that put CWF on the map, as well as the biggest feud in the history of the territory. There's a psychology in understanding professional wrestling, and I don't think anybody ever had that the way that the great Malenko had that. So he was the top heel in the state for, again, close to a decade. So what a run when you're the top heel in a state and you're drawing, you know, crowds of 3,000, 4,000, 8,000, 10,000. And you can do that on a weekly basis. He really understood how to get heat. He was a fantastic interview, and he was fantastic in the ring.
Eddie and Malenko were the top feud for years.
As Florida's top star, Eddie gGam was being groomed to take over the territory, but the transition in ownership came sooner than planned as Cowboy Luttrell fell ill and retired.
He was still a fairly young man. He was in his 60s, but he had been in ill health for years, and I think it was 71 when he decided to retire. He sold his stake to Eddie gGam, and he was in a nursing home at that point and receiving some sort of care, and he passed away in 1980. But at that point, Eddie had been kind of running the show for a couple of years prior to that. But by 1971, it was Eddie's territory.
Eddie gGam took it from a wintertime promotion into a year-round promotion to a multi-million-dollar promotion, and one of the most respected promotions, if not the most respected promotion in the entire United States.
With Eddie gGam being so smart in how the wrestling was done, he had someone who could articulate it on the air, and that was Gordon Solie. Gordon Solie, arguably the best, and particularly in his prime, the best wrestling announcer ever.
Cowboy Luttrell is the one that hired my dad. Dad was a DJ at the time and had wrestlers on his show. That's how he caught the eye of Cowboy Luttrell. Dad also announced at the Sunshine Speedway. Before Dad's first show, he asked Cowboy how he wanted him to call it, and Cowboy said, "Call it like your job depends on it." Cowboy Luttrell knew that without a great announcer, wrestling can be boring, and he needed someone that could spice it up, and that's what he found in Gordon. Gordon knew it was his job to put the wrestlers over, big time, and not himself. But in the end, the wrestling industry put him over as the voice of all of wrestling.
Gordon is one of those guys that could make a boring match into an exciting match, people watching it. And he'd come up with some names for some of the holes that people had that I said, what kind of hole was that?
Gordon Solie was the guy, you know. Gordon Solie was my role model. I wanted to be Gordon Solie.
If Gordon liked you, everything would run along fine with him. But if he didn't really care that much for you, he could be just as negative on the rundown as he was for the build-up.
He was the golden voice of Florida Championship Wrestling. He didn't try to get Gordon Solie over. He worked hard to get the wrestlers over. That was his interview skill. That was the magic of Gordon Solie. It was all done to get the wrestler over, and in doing that, guess who got over? Gordon Solie, like $1 million. He was the dean of professional wrestling announcers.
He was the person, whenever you saw Championship Wrestling from Florida, his voice was a tag team partner of that program.
For those of you who may not have seen the last couple of programs, Harley Race has unquestionably put a bounty, and it's rumored to be somewhere in the vicinity of $20,000 on the head of Dusty Rhodes, trying to keep Dusty Rhodes from getting a chance again at the World Championship.
Gordon was awesome. I mean, you know, Gordon had the ability to pull you out when you were going down a dead-end street. And I had the tendency to ramble, being nervous, staring at a camera, trying to say something interesting, trying to sell tickets while I'm talking. And then sometimes I'd just get off on a tangent, and Gordon would just kind of just stare like a puppy at you and turn his head from side to side. And I knew I was lost. And I'm almost begging, Gordon, say something to get me out of this. But he had that magic that he'd come in and say, all right, and then kind of make something out of nothing.
It was a presentation that Gordon could give a wrestler that would would set him apart from other people. And people come in there, hey, you get a match called by Gordon Solie, you get over.
Good shoulder smash by Garvin has Rossitani down. Rossitani drops to the canvas. Garvin charges back. Rossitani has him full body slammed. Rossitani comes down with that elbow. Garvin rolls out of the way just in time. Wait a minute, Saito. Saito now destroying that Indian headdress. Saito completely destroying that Indian headdress. There are feathers all over the center of that ring. The spoiler caught by Andre the Giant, and now they're after the spoiler's mask. They're after the spoiler's mask.
Just the way he presented the match, the way he talked about it. He would use words that you know today about holes, and he would just, his flow was great. Just right on, right on, right on.
Gordon was like, it was like Wide World of Sports, ESPN, it was like NFL. I mean, Gordon was unbelievable. He was brilliant. I mean, he was unbelievable. He was so credible. He was like a Walter Cronkite type guy, you know, he was unreal.
You had such a strong in-ring product, and now you had a guy that was, for all intents and purposes, a legitimate broadcaster now calling professional wrestling. And I think that's what really took CWF to the next level.
Gordon Solie helped fill up a mania coliseum, let's put it that way.
Gordon Solie is more the face of Florida wrestling than anybody. You mention Florida wrestling, and first name that comes up is Gordon Solie. It's never Eddie Graham.
He was just your TV guy, but he was so recognizable, it made him a celebrity in the state of Florida.
To me, Gordon Solie was the greatest announcer ever. And that's, you know, Lance Russell was great, Jim Ross was great, but Gordon Solie was the man and always will.
Gordon was the guy, though, that I kind of structured my game around as far as being authentic and being believable, trying to basically present, because I was told to, but I felt this way too, present the product like it was a legitimate sport with great respect and reverence to the athlete and the process. Gordon did that. So I acquired that, and I've tried to keep that in place all these years.
There's great announcers out there, even today, but there'll never be another Gordon Solie.
Until next week, so long.
Eddie Graham. He was a genius. He learned the business from my father, Dory Funk Sr. in the Amarillo Territory.
So Eddie had kind of cut his teeth in the West Texas promotion underneath Dory Funk Sr. And he kind of modeled himself after Dory Funk Sr. Dory Sr. was huge in the community, had his hand in everything that he could. Everybody knew who Dory Sr. was, and Eddie took that model and ran with it down in Tampa.
Eddie Graham would tell you, sit down and write right here, right now, and tell you where he learned about professional wrestling and how to book cards, and you know, a great deal of it he learned from my father.
He started the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch, which was the Eddie Graham Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch, which he had seen out in West Texas with Cal Farley. He was very involved with politics. He was good friends with the sheriff of Hillsborough County. So he was big, you know, making donations to schools and universities. So they were really big on getting wrestling. I should say Eddie Graham, Coach John Heath, Don Curtis were three guys instrumental on getting amateur wrestling in the state of Florida to junior high, high schools, and colleges as well.
They were both wrestling coaches and officials. So that was our role here. Not only did we have to work every day and wrestle every night, but we had to go to these high schools and put on clinics and put on demonstrations and put on free shows for aspiring young wrestlers and help build the sport of amateur wrestling. That's the type of territory that Eddie Graham ran here, and it should have been the prototype for every territory in the world.
Dad got in the community, he had good TV, he kept everything very real, and he kept everything very violent.
He got away with some violent angles where people mostly would complain, but they would say, well, after this scene you get a reward from the mayor for your work with the youth, and Eddie getting a flag, and then us donating every match that we ran. They got a cut on the Sheriff's Boys Ranch for
underprivileged children, and then the Police Athletic League, and I mean, we're a social network of the community.
He wanted respect. That's all Eddie wanted. Eddie wanted respect among the community.
To me, Florida wrestling was one of the strongholds of the NWA, one because of the promoter, Eddie Graham. What he had in the state of Florida was not only a good wrestling name, but he had a good name in the community. He was known to donate money. He was known to work with kids and stuff like that. So wrestling wasn't wrestling. It was, you know, this is championship wrestling from Florida. They presented a product that was a little community-based.
It was legit. It was believable. Nobody ever questioned that. Eddie was a philanthropist. Eddie was making donations. He was, you know, holding all these fundraisers, doing all this charity work. So he was an accepted person within the political community in the state of Florida.
Florida had a classiness about the promotion that started from Eddie Graham, trickled down to the wrestlers and Gordon Soley. He kept it classy.
Was Eddie Graham really the genius that everybody says he was? I think Eddie gets undersold a lot of time. Eddie was just way before his time.
They've always called him the best finished man in the history of professional wrestling.
Eddie was great. I always called him the Godfather. I think everybody called him the Godfather. And I asked him one time, I said, Eddie, what can you give me any information on what I can do better? And he said, kid, you got too much pizzazz. Because in the ring, I always loved to move. I was a mover. And you'd get a hold on Eddie Graham, and he'd lay there for 5 minutes and finally move a little finger. And when he did that, people would start going nuts. By the time he got to his feet, you couldn't hear yourself think. He was a master.
And Eddie was a fundamentalist, sound, and he had used great logic in his booking. He was just a genius.
Eddie Graham had the reputation of being a true genius. And here's a guy who had a 7th grade education, who just understood the psychology of our business. He was like an encyclopedia.
It was my mentor, really, Eddie Graham, and the greatest man in this business, period, ever, in the history of this business, as far as wrestling went.
Eddie was in control of everything. He could sit down and talk to you about a wrestling match with arguments, fights, distractions all throughout the dressing room, and he could concentrate about your performance in the ring, what you were going to do and how you were going to do it. Never get distracted. He would zero right in, and he could call all the shots. He was a genius.
If Eddie Graham was your mentor, it was like having a degree in professional wrestling, because not only did you have the physical skills to compete on the top level, but you also had the right psychology that he taught you.
And he had some of the greatest talent of all times come through there.
Well, part of it was the weather in Florida, going to the beach. Florida women are beautiful. And so a lot of guys, you know, I'm in Florida, it's warm weather, and got a lot of good-looking women, and again, great talent. Now, the money isn't always as good as you thought maybe it should be, but I think a lot of guys went there and worked because it was Florida, and they weren't there to be around Eddie Graham.
Man, I would have loved to be in the Florida territory. Think about, like, you're wrestling in paradise. You know, in the wintertime, I'm going to Florida for 6 months, hon. Let's go do this territory.
It was phenomenal business to run within an area that small. And whenever I'm talking about small geographically, where your furthest trip was 280 miles, you know, to Miami, that wasn't a bad doggone deal.
There was a hotbed of professional wrestling, you know, during the late 60s, you know, throughout the 70s. You know, it was definitely what Eddie Graham was doing down in Florida.
With Eddie's in-ring career slowing down, he set his eyes on a young amateur wrestler from Oklahoma as the territory's next big star, Jack Briscoe.
It was readily apparent that Jack was going to be the big deal, and he quickly went from coming in the state of Florida to getting a main event push, and was really the star from say 69 up until he won the world title in 73.
Eddie had a real affinity for amateur wrestling. And of course, there wasn't anybody better than Jack. You know, NCAA champion 1965 from Oklahoma State. And you know, paid his dues. You know, started off in the Oklahoma Territory with McGurk and then going to Amarillo. And, you know, Jack worked setting up the ring early on. He worked as a referee early on, you know, and started wrestling. So when he came to Florida, not only did he have it all, I mean, Jack was a good-looking guy, certainly, was articulate, had an amateur background, second to none, that Eddie saw, you know, how he could build a territory around Jack.
Jack, to me, was my hero. He was the all-around babyface, good guy. The girls all loved him, you know, just like everybody loved Jack Briscoe. He was phenomenal.
What did Jack Briscoe mean to Florida Championship Wrestling? And I could answer with a question, what did Mickey Mantle mean to the New York Yankees? He was young and handsome and vibrant, an amazing athlete. I don't know of anybody I've ever seen that was a better pure wrestler than Jack Briscoe.
Jack was just clearly different, such a different personality and just such a fresh breath of fresh air to what they've been seeing here. Jack exploded in popularity here.
And Eddie Graham saw that, saw the good-looking guy, the females loved him, the men respected him, he was tough, he was unassuming, he was real, and Jack never played a character. Jack just played Jack. And that's all Eddie wanted, because that way when you do a promo and you're being yourself, people don't think they're being worked.
Jack Briscoe was so good, and I think fans today in YouTube land don't give Jack Briscoe enough credit.
I remember watching Jack in the hallway, and I used to, well, before I got the opportunity to be in the dressing rooms and the hallways, I always wondered, I wonder what they do to warm up. I mean, you know, because as I started learning to wrestle, we did a lot of exercises and squats and things. And I saw Jack Briscoe, and he's smoking a cigarette. He does one jumping jack, puts a cigarette out, and goes out and wrestles for an hour straight. And I'm going, wow. I mean, I didn't smoke and didn't want to smoke, but it was the idea. That's a warm-up there, buddy.
And Jack Briscoe, bless his heart, I said, Jack, you want to warm up before our match? I was wrestling him in Miami. I had wrestled Lou Thez the week before and beat Lou Thez. That gave me a title shot with Jack. So I told Jack before our match, I said, you want to work out a little bit or stretch a little bit before our match? He said, yeah, I guess so. He put a Winston cigarette in his mouth and did about 3 side straddle hops and said, that's it, I'm ready, Bob. And he was. That guy had more, he could wrestle forever.
Jack was so unique, and there was no attitude, no ego, no me this, no I did this in his system. He was such a modest and humble guy that people loved to be around him, people loved to work with him, people loved to help him out.
He was the face of the franchise, that young, handsome face that was the best athlete in the locker room and a tough son of a gun.
He quickly became Dory Funk Jr.'s #1 challenger, and everybody believed Jack Briscoe was going to win the world title.
Due to the fact that I was drawing so well here that it was just a natural that they put me with Junior. Sooner or later, and Junior and I would work for the world's title. And Terry come in and spend the summer here one time, and so Terry and I, Terry kind of set up the matches for Junior and I too, because Terry and I had a program, and we sold out Tampa like 13 straight times.
He was so beautiful to wrestle. He was amateur wrestler all the way. He had the backing of Florida Championship Wrestling, Eddie Graham. I went through Florida Championship Wrestling the first time, and the second time, and the third time, and wrestled quite a few people. We drew good, we did good business, but we didn't have that box office attraction that we knew every time, any place, we're going to sell out. And Jack Briscoe filled that bill.
There was this magic when Dory Funk Jr. and Jack Briscoe got together. They complemented each other.
Jack Briscoe was down there. He was a Florida heavyweight champion, and he was constantly trying to beat Dory for that belt, and they had some classics.
To this day, if you watch a Briscoe Funk match, you know, it's relevant. In the matches he had with Junior and Terry, and the tag matches, him and Gerald and against the Funks, is legendary.
When people ask me about great matches from various decades, that was the best match of the 70s there?
We started doing hour Broadways everywhere because the match was so popular and such a financial hit that we just started doing hour Broadways everywhere we went. We went all over the country and ended up in Japan, all over the world doing hour Broadways.
I wrestled Jack Briscoe 150 times, and he was a fabulous opponent. He was and not only in Florida, but St. Louis. I wrestled him in Japan, Dallas, Texas, every territory across the country. I could walk in the ring with Jack Briscoe, and we knew it was going to be a sellout, and we knew it was going to be a great wrestling match.
You say the Funks, and they'll immediately go back to the matches between the Briscoes and the Funks. It's just magic in Florida.
The primary was obviously Jack versus Dory. Then it became Jack versus Terry because Terry won the NWA World's Heavyweight title in Miami Beach, December 10th, 1975 from Jack. Then it would become, say, Jerry versus Dory, which for a period we have Jerry versus Terry, and then it was Briscoes versus Funks also.
The Funks and Briscoes, I think it was one of those natural matches that every promotion wanted in their territory, and just about every promotion in the United States got that match in their territory, and it proved to be business for them.
This was an ingenious thing. The Briscoes and Funks made this like a football match. The baby faces in Florida were the Briscoes. The baby faces in Amarillo were the Funks. But they would shoot an angle in Florida and send it to Amarillo, and Eddie would splice the tape where it looked like the Briscoes were the heels. And they would do the same thing in Amarillo, where they would splice the tape and send it back into Florida. It looked like the Funks were the heels.
That was a great feud throughout the United States, with the Briscoe brothers against the Funk brothers, and it was just very, very productive.
While Jack Briscoe was the golden boy of championship wrestling from Florida, winning the NWA World's Heavyweight title took him on the road, traveling from territory to territory, which left a gap for the promotion's top star. Out of the blue, the man who had been Jack's biggest rival was now stepping into his shoes to carry the company. That man was Paul Jones.
I went to Florida and I wrestled against Jack, and it was the biggest 2 years that I've ever had. It just capacity crowds all over Florida.
Paul had, in my opinion, one of the greatest angles in the history of professional wrestling, and he was the first guy to ever do this that I'm aware of.
The big thing was when I threw the Florida Heavyweight Championship belt off the Gandy Bridge. They didn't believe I'd do it.
You'll still hear people talk about Paul Jones taking the Florida title and throwing it off the bridge.
He went on television one day and basically said, I'm going to take this title. He was having issues with Buddy Fuller, and said, I'm going to take this title and I'm going to throw it off the Gandy Bridge, and if you don't believe me, be there on this date and I'll do it.
I had somebody drive me out there to the bridge with the belt, and about a mile before we got to the bridge, that there was lines on both sides of the street. I mean, like a parade. And anyway, the closer we got to the bridge, I said, slow down. So eventually we were going so slow that the people were running behind the car, and they followed me up the bridge, the middle of the bridge. So I got out, and they took some practice swings. And before I threw it, I looked below down the water, and there were boats all over. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Boats all over, all over there. And anyway, I ended up throwing the belt off the bridge, and that was the biggest thing.
It made the newspapers, it made the TV, and it was a great angle because it furthered his career in the state of Florida.
The rest of that year, it was fantastic business. And Jack Briscoe, he won the world belt from the Funks, and so he became world champion. So when he left Florida, then I switched over to a good guy. Anyway, we had fantastic business for another year or so, maybe 2 years complete.
And there was that gap between 73 and 74 where Paul Jones was the top babyface, but it was apparent Dusty Rhodes was going to be the guy. But Paul wasn't Jack and Paul wasn't Dusty. And that's not a knock on Paul.
With Championship Wrestling from Florida being the driving force in the National Wrestling Alliance, Eddie Graham was looked to as a leader for other promoters within the alliance and held weight with non-alliance members like Vince McMahon Sr.
Eddie Graham had a lot of political pull with the NWA, and I think rightfully so. I mean, he had a great promotion. He'd wrestled forever. He knew the sport. He drew good crowds, and I think he was fair. He shared talent, with other promoters. So I think he was certainly highly respected.
Eddie Graham was close with Vince McMahon's father. Eddie Graham was close to Dory Funk Sr. He was politically as well connected with Sam Mushnick as anybody and as powerful as anybody because they looked to him for advice, and he was a major power in professional wrestling in the 70s.
They had a very good relationship. Yeah, because Eddie Graham had worked for Vince a lot with him and Jerry Graham, the Graham brothers. And so when he went down there and joined Cowboy Luttrell in partnership, and Vince actually tried to help him too. So no, they had a good relationship.
Vince Sr., I think, looked to Eddie for several things. There was a mutual respect there.
There was so much respect there that when it came time to replace superstar Billy Graham as the champion, Vince Sr. looked to Eddie Graham to help make the decision.
The story was that it was coming down to three guys. It was coming down to Backlund, it was coming down to Steve Kern, and it was coming down to Roop. But the story came down really to Kern versus Backlund. I think Vince Sr. and Eddie were extremely tight. Vince Sr., I think, had a winter home in West Palm Beach. And he spent a lot of time in the state of Florida. He and Eddie were extremely close.
Eddie Graham sold Vince Sr. on Bob Backlund. They said, here is your next Bruno Sammartino ethnic. Here's a kid from the Midwest. Bruno Italian ethnic. Well, here's a Midwest kid. Well, yeah, here is a Midwest kid, but doesn't have any charisma. And these folks convinced Senior to put the deal on Bobby Backlund, man, and people tried to talk him out of it. He had so much pride, Vince Senior had so much pride that once he made a commitment, even though he knew he was doing wrong, pride, he wouldn't turn it around. And he gave it to Backlund, and he had so many guys on the cards because the house is just.
I think Eddie was viewed as a rock. I think he was viewed as somebody that was very stable, that was running a very successful territory, and nobody fucked around with Eddie Graham.
With Eddie's political pull and strong relationship with Vince McMahon Sr., Eddie was allowed to have the Florida show played on a UHF Spanish-speaking channel in New York.
You would see it every week, so it made people aware in New York that there was another territory.
They had a Spanish station carry them. So people in New York knew what Championship Wrestling from Florida was, but they watched it in Spanish, so because you weren't breaking into someone else's territory if you weren't speaking English.
And our TV was syndicated, I guess, into New York at 12 midnight. And like an Icon, Bob Dylan, or it became it became the thing to watch before you went out at midnight.
It was airing in New Jersey, which was then getting New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and it was airing at different cities across the U.S.
It aired in New Bern, North Carolina. The Florida tape played in a few territories because there were alliance members and it was to keep opposition from getting a TV station.
Vince Sr. also saw that as, wow, I can bring up somebody from Florida that's going to connect to my Latino audience, and genius.
They'd have wrestlers on a Monday night at Madison Square Garden because Eddie Graham was good friends with Vince Sr. Wrestling Wednesday night in Miami. So you'd get guys that you would see in the wrestling magazines, you would get them in Florida because of the relationship that Eddie had with Vince Sr.
The first Garden show, which I'm jumping ahead, that I was on, I never made a TV for Vince, for Senior. It was all off the Florida TV the first time. It was sold out. Me and Superstar did everything off Florida. And actually never made a TV there until after 2 or 3 of the garden shows.
It was one of those things that it almost transcended wrestling. Certainly if you were a wrestling fan, you were watching the show, but everybody watched it.
That was a unique situation because Jack Briscoe was the biggest thing that had hit Florida in years. Dusty came in at the time when Jack was the world's heavyweight champion. And Florida was a situation, if Jack Briscoe wasn't on the card, it was very hard to draw money. You could get a house, but you couldn't do big business.
Well, I went there as a heel, you know. Right. And then Jack Briscoe, when he became world heavyweight champion. Well, I wrestled in Miami Beach Convention Center for an hour, and the people turned me there. They actually did. I know it's not a cliche. It's, you know, said this guy's working. You know, the interview's not a work. They actually turned me against Jack because I covered him. He put his foot on the rope, and he was a huge baby face. Right. And they just roared, man. And Eddie on the way back that night, he said, "It's time." You know what I mean? And Paxson Nam and Gary Hart were the ones that turned me.
They paired up Dusty Rhodes, who was not yet the American Dream, with a Korean wrestler, Pak Song. And they were part of Gary Hart's army.
It was obvious to all of us that Dusty was becoming a fan favorite because him and I would do little things during the match where I would try to tell him something to do and he would rebel and tell me no, and I would demand he do it. He would jump out of the ring, come down and point it. So the people, we were giving them little hints that something was up.
The match came in Tampa. It was May of 1974, and it was Mike and Eddie Graham versus Pak Song Nam and Dusty Rhodes.
Dusty was standing on the apron. Pak Song was in the ring. My dad got over close to Dusty, and Dusty grabbed my dad to hold him from the outside. And when he did, Pak Song wound up to give Dad a big chop. When he did, Dad ducked. He hit Dusty and knocked him off the apron down onto the floor. And then my dad ducked around and then he hit Dad. Anyway, Pak Song was on my dad, pounding on him. And Dusty, being Dusty, got mad because his partner had smacked him. He rolls in the ring and grabs Pak Song and starts punching Pak Song. And then Dad then gets up and he jumps on Dusty, and then I grab my dad and I'm going, no, he helped you. I mean, you know, because Dad was a little delirious, his head was bleeding and everything. So I grabbed my dad and I go, no, Dusty came in and he got Pak Song. I'm trying to explain to him in the ring that he had come in to help my dad when Dad was in trouble. And so then they wound up shaking hands. That was like the handshake that was heard around the world.
And from then on, he was the American Dream.
Nobody had ever seen anything like Dusty Rhodes when he turned from the hated outlaw Dusty Rhodes to the American Dream. The only thing I can compare it with is when Hulk Hogan would come out at Madison Square Garden and all the fans would go crazy and you'd get goosebumps. Pre-Hulk Hogan, that was Dusty Rhodes.
We knew it was going to be good, but I don't think anyone really understood what was going to happen. I mean, once he made that switch and became the American Dream, I mean, we sold out every arena for 16 weeks.
You hear everybody sitting down telling you, from my generation, back in the day, it was a sellout. It was a sellout, right? This was a legit. Every arena was sold out. It was the first time I ever saw, until this day, I think, people scalping tickets to get into the wrestle matches.
When Dusty turned, it was an explosion of epic proportion.
The people in Florida fell in love with Dusty, and business just skyrocketed.
Dusty was probably the most uncommon common man I think anyone had ever met. He could connect with anyone. You know, he was great. And he didn't try to be anything, you know, that he wasn't.
You either have that or you don't. You cannot teach it. You can't coach it.
Dusty had this innate ability to connect with the masses. Whether you be Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, didn't matter.
These fists are like lightning bolts
flashing from the sky. My legs are like electrified fusion. I wear afro sheen on my hair. I don't care if you're black, white, brown, green, or yellow. You all can get off on Dusty Road, because I never had a dang thing until I went out and tried and reached for a dream. Now I'm here to stay. I did not come to play.
His voice touched something that was relevant and that, resonated. So it was that it factor of being able to connect with the audience.
I had the ability to put asses in the seats. I had the ability to be the executive producer before it even had a title. I had the ability to write the shows. I created so much talent.
Just a wonderful character. Very charismatic. And I mean that so much about him.
The American Dream was a creation of mine that came out of my head. It meant something because I made it real. I didn't do an interview, or I gave them a message with it. And I still do today with the kids and the people that it's corny, I know, for this interview, but American Dream, there is one. No matter what, there is. We're all living it.
Dusty Rhodes' interviews was what captivated the fans. More than anything he did, it was the interviews. And on the second level, he'd get in the ring and start wiggling his butt. And he just connected with the fans so well.
Dusty was a phenomenon that comes along once in a generation.
People could relate to him. And he never talked down to them. He talked like he was one of them. God, they loved him.
He was the thing, man. He was the thing. I know anywhere he'd go was a sellout. He'd just gotten over with that lisp he had and the way he talked, and great interview. And he was just the man. The guys his size that was doing what he was doing was just magic for the people in Florida.
More charisma than 1,000 people combined, 2,000 people combined. The guy was absolutely incredible. And even as a heel, and he certainly was a nasty, dastardly heel, there was something about him that when you watched him, you were kind of mesmerized by this guy.
I was making 120, 150 grand, and I was on top of the world. I was a king. I mean, there was God there. Governors would come to me to get elected, and they would.
The mayor of Tampa at the time, Dick Greco, just had an election. He made a comment shortly after. He said, "I'm so glad the election was 6 months ago and I didn't have to run against Dusty Rhodes." He said, "because I would have got beaten in a landslide." That's how popular Dusty was. Dusty could have run for mayor, dog catcher, anything, and won by a landslide. He was just the most over thing I'd ever, up until that time, I'd ever seen in my life.
I remember as a kid, I remember walking into convenience stores and the guy behind the counter was doing Dusty Rhodes' impression.
Without question, Dusty was the hottest thing Florida ever had.
Being the son of a prominent figure in professional wrestling has its benefits, but also comes with a lot of backlash. No one understood that more than the son of Eddie Graham, Mike. Not the biggest or the tallest athlete in the ring, Mike made his way in professional wrestling on his own terms.
I'll always defend Mike Graham. Was there nepotism? I can't say that there wasn't, because his father was Eddie Graham. At the same time, I don't feel that Mike was handed anything.
Mike had a hard road to go, but Mike handled it with dignity and class. I don't know if anybody else could have handled the way he did. He knew in his heart that he'd never be world heavyweight champion. And he would do anything for his father, and he came to the realization, being the promoter's son is not easy, and he took some shit, but he was a tough guy, and if you gave him too much shit, he was going to get in your face, and you didn't want to get in a fight with him because you'd probably get beat up. Or the second thing was, if you didn't get beat up, you were going to be on the outs. They wouldn't have fired you, but you were going to be on the outs. But he came to a realization that his job was to carry on the Graham legacy in wrestling, but to build the guys to work in the main events.
He prepared me. I was 5-time state AAU amateur wrestling champion before I turned pro. I was the first person in Florida to ever bench press 400 pounds at a 198 body weight in AAU competition. A couple years later, I did a 455 at a 198 body weight, which were things so I was strong, I could wrestle. He gave me all the tools to get as good as I could get before I turned pro. But even at that, the pressure really, and a lot of it came from him, because I wanted to do good for him. Because he was one of those guys who would sit on the railing at the Armory and watch everything I did. It was a constant school, you know, of every night. Every night I loved going someplace where he wasn't going to be, because I knew I could go out, I could wrestle, I could come back, and it was a constant scrutiny.
If you look at what Mike's career in the state of Florida was, he made a splash in '72 when he debuted. And then he was put into a tag team role, and the tag team role lasted for the better part of 7 or 8 years. Mike was a partner with Kevin Sullivan for a year, and then the long run with Steve Kern. So, you know, he wasn't pushed to the main events. Mike didn't win the Florida title until after being in the business for 10 years. So it wasn't like Eddie Graham was pushing this guy to the moon. It wasn't happening. He knew where Mike was best positioned on a card, and Mike was very successful, and Mike was a legitimate wrestler.
Mike was always too small at 90% of the time when his father was the head there and things were coming up. And a little later on, when he started working out and bettering himself build-wise and stuff, he come along pretty good then.
I could take care of myself. You know, a lot of the veterans that from the earlier days that might have had some animosity or something toward my dad was because they weren't as good as they thought they were. They probably believed their own advertising, and there wasn't too many of them that could beat me. So, I mean, if they came out and started playing, I was a player. No, I was always treated with respect, and everybody knew. My dad made it clear that, you know, okay, I was his son, but, you know, he wasn't in the ring with me. He gave me an opportunity, and I had the ability to take advantage of that opportunity.
Great mind for the business. Being brought up with his dad, you know, could work and sell.
He lived in his father's shadows his whole career, his whole life. That, okay, I'm not going to be world heavyweight champion, but I'm going to be the best asset for this company and get guys over to draw us money. And that's what he did.
Whenever I hear nepotism and he only, you know, Mike only had a career because of who his father was, then you never saw Mike Graham. Because Mike Graham was as over in that building as anybody else was.
Most people don't survive plane crashes. I mean, they just don't survive plane crashes.
I didn't have time to think. I was listening to my Walkman. I was sitting in the back next to Bobby, and we're coming out of Miami, and we called for approach to come into Peter O'Knight, and they say, well, the weather's moving across the bay. Maybe, you know, should land in Sarasota. So we set our course to land in Sarasota. And as we were getting ready to go into Sarasota, a guy from Peter O'Knight called, the control guy, and said, we can get you in before the start if you want to come on to Peter O'Knight. So, right, we got maybe 5 miles, 6 miles on our approach, and we got socked in. I mean, we flew into a storm cloud, and we couldn't get out of it. We would go up and we'd go down, but we couldn't break through.
We had tried to land one time because the weather was foggy, you know, visibility was hideous. Buddy wasn't instrument rated, so anyway, he was flying somewhere where he shouldn't have been. That was a big issue, you know. But anyway, so he circled around. When he first tried to land on the airstrip, he was too high, so when he circled around, he went over the residential area. Back, it's a good thing. I mean, it crashed. It was a good thing it crashed in the water, not in a neighborhood. And he lost. I'm sure he lost airspeed as he was banking to go back to the runway. And I'm sure he lost airspeed and he crashed. You know, and the last thing really that I remember, I mean, I was really focused on. I'm looking for the runway too. You know, I mean, it's a very tense moment.
I bet.
Nobody's talking. Ain't no jokes here now. I mean, everybody's intense, and everybody realizes, you know, this is serious. And the last thing that I saw was Tampa Bay, the waves of Tampa Bay, and it was choppy that night because I saw the Whitecaps.
A moment before we hit, Austin Idol said, "Pull up, we're going to hit the water." So I reached down and popped my belt, and luckily, as the plane hit wingtip over wingtip, it drew me clear from the plane. Wow. And there I was in Tampa Bay at 2 o'clock in the morning, popped to the top of the water, realized I had survived. Didn't see Buddy, didn't see Austin Idol, didn't see Buddy Cole or Bobby Shane. Wow. All I could see was a light way off into the distance, so I started swimming towards the light.
I mean, he flew it in the water, and that long for it to register, you're dead.
Once I got closer, I came across Austin Idol, and Austin was panicking pretty bad. Couldn't make it in, so I told him just relax, lay back, and I brought him to the seawall. And then Buddy Cole, I heard him hollering, "Is anyone there? Is anyone there?" So I went back out and I got Buddy Cole.
Right.
Brought Buddy Cole into the seawall. He was pretty messed up himself. And then I went back out to try to find Bobby. Couldn't find Bobby. Looked for a while, I don't know how long. But I was getting weak by then. My head was open up 180 stitches, cut off my nose, lost my right eye, fractured my sternum, fractured clavicle, broken wrist, broken arm, broken leg, vertebrae in the back. And I was beginning to get weak, you know, and so I thought, well, it's best, you know, try to get out of this place we're at.
I fast forwarded to "You're dead." I thought I was dead, but obviously it wasn't my time. It was Bobby Shane's, but it wasn't my time.
Bobby Shane was a guy that he's achieved almost an Elvis-like status now, with this cult-like status of dying so young. A lot of people will say it was the darkest day in the history of CWF. What would have happened had that plane crash not occurred? Would Buddy Cole have become an NWA World Heavyweight Champion? Because everybody felt that he had the credentials to do it. So it threw everything into disarray. Lives lost, careers ended.
When tragedy strikes, the show must go on. With the god of the Florida Territory, the American dream, it was only natural for a devil to rise up.
It's the 80s, right? It's big hair, big tits, big muscles, right? And rock and roll is big hair, loud bands, and the dark side. The genre of the horror movies are the sky high as they've ever been. And I was watching it one day and I said, you know, with all my travels that I've done and my research I've done, why don't I kind of say that I've been to the Far East and I've accepted their way of life, and there was I'm not proud of this because this one part, because but it was the way of life back then. I started to put dark circles under my eyes as a baby face. Just where you couldn't probably notice it at first, but then people would say, "Oh boy, he looks tired." Well, drugs were big back in the 80s, so it was like, what's wrong with this guy? He doesn't look the same, you know what I mean?
And he came back as a baby face, but he looked a little different. He was in much better shape. He was muscular, and his attitude was a little different, and he was wrestling a rougher style. But it was great because they drugged this out.
If you watch the first part of the character, it doesn't look like anything like the end of the character. And I've always said, if you want to tell a story, you don't give the plot out at the first chapter. So I built it, and I was allowed to go with it. And I had the greatest baby faces in that era to work with. I had Barry Windham, Mike Graham, Steve Kern, Dusty Rhodes, Blackjack Mulligan. I mean, and they all did business for me. They all got behind me and gave me the push.
Somebody put a bounty on Barry Windham, and Jake Roberts wound up collecting the bounty, and it came out that it was Kevin Sullivan that did it, and then the term was complete. And then the transformation started, where he went from this slightly maniacal Kevin Sullivan to Kevin Sullivan, you know, and he hates being associated with the devil. He never referred to himself as that, but you know, it was like the devil worshiper.
When I watched that gimmick, I wasn't sure where they were going with this because I had never seen anything that broad-based in pro wrestling.
I was lucky enough that they said, hey, let's get behind this thing and see where it takes us. If not, we could always pull the plug. And you know, it was like from 81 to 86, I had that run.
Kevin, he believed, he honestly believed that the cops couldn't see him. That he didn't think he was Satan, but he thought he was one of Satan's angels. Him and Mark Lewin, you talk about a trip, brother. But Purple Haze.
And they never told us who the Purple Haze was until the Purple Haze showed up, and then it was like, that's Mark Lewin.
And when I saw him as the Purple Haze, I didn't know it was the same guy. He made of the devil even more intense.
I remember when Mark Lewin, as the Purple Haze, was being introduced, we went down to Daytona Beach, freezing cold, and shot this thing at night in a full moon, and Kevin Sullivan had all the bones down on the sand, and Mark went out into the ocean and then came up out of the water with his eyes rolled back in his head, and the moon, I mean, it was a one-camera shoot that you look at it today and it's, woo.
Timing and luck plays a lot in it. That night, the moon was full. We didn't know it was going to be full. We went to a secluded part of the beach. So when I conjured him out of the ocean, you know, some people thought, whoa, but they bought into it like they did a movie. So now they got a vested interest.
It was amazing to see the devil worship and the pythons, the snakes, and this demonic deal he had, you know, with the girls and all the humperdink and all the demonic devil stuff. Is like, this really is the dark side here. You know, this is really dark.
We lived our gimmick. We went everywhere in our robes, to the gym, to shopping centers, everywhere. To the bar, we wore our robes. When we drove to towns, we would wear our robes.
He took it to the limit. He pushed it as hard as he could push it. And like I say, I mean, people were saying, devil go home, writing on the walls. You know, we were getting mail and stuff from preachers and reverends, and you know, how can you have the devil worshiper on your TV?
It was so heavy. They're burning cars in the parking lot at Eddie Graham Sports Center. They're burning cars out there. Demonic devil stuff.
It got crazy because I was out and out heel except for one town, Orlando. There was a group of kids, and this is what Jack's talking about, that were really heel fans. The night I really burnt Jack and Kendall and Barry, as these kids were leaving the parking lot, they lit their van on fire.
I got called in by the preacher, and the preacher gave me a pretty good butt chewing about, hey Jack, all these kids are watching this stuff. A kid set fire to himself over at Winn-Dixie at the store, and he got it from TV.
You had religious groups that were very upset by what he was doing. They were calling for a boycott. They were picketing. They were making their frustrations known. But people believed that this was legitimate. This was not a wrestling angle. People believed that Kevin Sullivan had gone to the dark side.
There was rumored, and I don't know how true it is, but I'm going to tell, almost every town that we would go to, and Kevin was on the card, he would, not him, I ain't saying him, but in the local graves close to the building where we was wrestling, the stones in the graveyard would be turned over, and then when we leave, they'd be turned back. That was in the newspapers up there for almost 2 years. I think Kevin was doing it, but nobody can prove it.
And the whole key to it was, people talk about Kevin Sullivan playing the devil, but if you ever watched it and listened to it, he never said the word devil. He never said he was Satan. He never said he was worshiping Satan. Fans look back on that really entertained by it. That influenced Raven and ECW. That influenced a lot of folks.
He never mentioned the word the devil. I'm like, you're a genius. You let perception take over.
He was, he shot with that shit. And he had a following. And he had people that hated him, And how I would bring the people in television back to reality is we would sell it so hard that he was the devil. But in my interviews, I would make sure that they knew somehow at the end, whether it was a smile or whatever, that he wasn't really the devil. You know what I mean? And but they believed he was.
I even asked Dusty this. I said, Kevin Sullivan was the devil. He goes, baby, I was like a god in Florida. He goes, who else would be against me? The devil, baby.
Sometimes it got a little too heavy for me. And it was a little, over the top, in my opinion, but he drew money.
He drew a lot of money. He made a lot of money, and he always backed it up, and he never missed a town, and he didn't say anything that he was going to do that he didn't do, and so God bless him, if he wanted to put himself in that light, and he's still remembered in Florida as the devil.
And until Dusty got his notice, everything was going fine.
Jim Crockett said, I know you're good at this. You did the Last Tango in Tampa of naming shows and making them kind of bigger than they are, because that's really what I want to do, executive produce, make shows special and big, at the time. And can you do something, And I worked for Eddie at the time, and I wouldn't leave him. I would go out, but I had never ventured out for a long period of time out of Florida. And I said, okay, I'll think about it.
Dusty is the man that thunk up all these dadgum big arenas, the WrestleMania, the Starrcade, the Stampede. He come up with the names of all these big shows.
And it was Starrcade. I said, how about the match of the Starrcade? To where his promo, Jimmy's promo, we had the match of the decade, the match of the centuries, and now as we move on into our industry, the match, Starrcade. Right. I wanted to be like when WrestleMania then came to where Starrcade was something that was the granddaddy of them all on pay-per-view or whatever.
He told me, he got me off to the side, and he said, Bart, if you're not ready and willing to go on pay-per-view, and if you ain't willing, all the big shows are going to be pay-per-view. And he told me this before it was any pay-per-view. It's right before we did Starrcade out of Greensboro and seven other cities, and simulcast them suckers to the world. That was the first time it was done.
It was huge. It was never before done. It was a movie. I made a movie. In making that movie, I went to great pains behind the scenes to produce it and direct it, and to I've seen a new life for me, you know what I mean?
Dusty, to me, and with all his faults, was the most flamboyant, thinking outside the box person out there. And that's what we needed at that point.
And he had me come that night. And flew from Florida to Eddie, could I go to Starrcade? You always ask permission to leave the territory, to go, to give notice respectfully. And because I'd created it, he let me go. I didn't really care about the matches or what they had lined up. But I put on a three-piece suit and I went to Greensboro, and I seen the most unbelievable thing unfold. The greatest dog collar match of this day with Piper and Greg Valentine. And I seen this thing unfold. I said, the whole new world's getting ready to open up here. It's getting ready to go balls out. And about a week later, I got a check for $15,000. That's what I got for creating Starrcade that we still watch today.
Wow.
And I didn't work for him, but that was the most money I had made probably at one time. And then he flew to Tampa. And he says, I want you to come, book my territory.
He had told me that, Crockett had made him the offer. And he saw the writing on the wall that stuff was going wrong in Eddie's personal life. Dusty had a lot of guilt about leaving Eddie, but he also knew that the time was right to go and become the booker that he wasn't going to be able to be in Florida because it was always going to be Eddie Graham's.
The reason that we left, we're going to have this big show, Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida, the Lord of the Rings. And this is what happened, bottom line. Eddie Graham took the payoff for that night only. Dusty Rhodes did all the rest of the payoffs. And Eddie Graham, and he's dead, but he's still done, it's still the truth. So the truth will set you free. Eddie Graham stiffed every wrestler from top to bottom on that card. Every manager, every wrestler. And he paid us absolutely about half of what we were supposed to get.
He said, hey, I believe we got screwed, boys. What do you think? Well, we did too. He says, we've got this offer. Y'all with me? I always told us that Dusty, where you go, that's where I'm going. And so that's what happened. We all had enough faith in Dusty. If he says we're going and Crockett's promised this, we took Dusty's word and we went.
Dusty come and told me I'm leaving. I'm going to Charlotte. And didn't even ask me to go. I said, well, I'm not going.
It kind of broke my dad's heart in that he had given Dusty part of the Florida territory for free. When Dusty left, he took Barry, he took Magnum, he took Ron Bass, he took half the territory with him. And that really made Dad mad because here he spent 5 or 6 years giving Dusty the opportunity to create the American dream character and live it out and give him part of the territory and give him part of the building in Orlando and all that kind of stuff as perks and bonuses. And then when Dusty left, it was like he was almost trying to kill the territory for taking all the talent with him.
Dusty was a mastermind. He was he was the glue, man. He was the guy. He was the Bruno Sammartino of Florida. Dusty was the legend, man, legit. And so he was gone, and so it pretty much left a void.
But when he pulled out, it wasn't that just that Caesar left. He took the 7th Squadron with him, you know what I mean?
I was calling him to see if he could help me find a place to go, and Dusty said, well, I just got to deal with Jimmy Crockett. And he said, I'm going in there and taking over the thing in Charlotte. He said, pack your bags and just head for Charlotte.
We pulled out lock, stock, and barrel like overnight. I guess Eddie Graham went over there. The brother that sits at the front desk had to call Eddie Graham and say, listen, Eddie, we got no talent. That's the way it was.
Florida's decline has the same sins of any other territory. They weren't prepared to, big picture wise, to move forward. Nobody was there ready to take Dusty's place, either in the ring or in the office.
Eddie made the mistake a lot of promoters do. He hung his hat on one guy. And you can't do that. Dusty was so creative and so charismatic. It was hard to, you weren't going to top a Dusty Rose.
I just don't think that Eddie thought Dusty would ever do that. And when it did, it really sunk him. I think it was a tough road for Eddie. Everything was falling apart around him then, and then Dusty leaves. And he knows really the end is near.
All the territories were on their way by '84. Once the WWF with the national expansion, territories were suffering. Didn't matter where you were. Had Dusty not left, what would have been different? I still think 2 or 3 years down the road, we would have seen what would have been the death of CWF.
Dad was he kept everything bottled up. He was very tight-mouthed, never talked about problems or any of that kind of stuff. Guess he figured his shoulders were big enough that he could carry any weight or any issue, and then he could overcome it. That he'd created all those guys, and he'd just go create some more.
The wrestling world changed forever. Eddie Graham committed suicide. His wife Lucy found him when she came back from running some errands. Eddie was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital in Tampa, where he died a few hours later from the self-inflicted gunshot wounds. To this day, there are many rumors as to why, but no one really knows why he committed suicide.
Walked to the hospital, and there he sat back in the corner, his head all bandaged up and everything. Mom was crying, and the hospital full of people. Sat down with the doctors and said, "What do we do?" I said, "Will he ever walk, talk, see, get up, go to the bathroom?" No, he's done. The bullet didn't come out. The bullet went in his head and rattled around and went around and then just like destroyed everything. And he said not only that, but he said he shot himself twice. I said, "What?" I guess the first time he put the gun in his mouth, and when he pulled the trigger, he flinched, and it blew the side of his face off. His cheek and jawbone and all that kind of stuff was gone. Put the gun in his other hand and put it up the side of his head. I said, "Well, it was no accident." I thought, well, maybe he was cleaning the gun and it went off or something. I was grasping at anything to say, my dad really didn't commit suicide by shooting himself. He didn't do it. Well, he did.
But you talk about toughness. Eddie Graham took a gun, put it in his mouth, pulled the trigger, and didn't kill himself with the first shot, just blew the side of his face off. Cocked it, fired a second time. You talk about a tough guy.
The doctor said, he'll be a vegetable the rest of his life, he'll never get out of bed. And I said, you don't want to live that way. He didn't want to live healthy, much less in the state that he's in. So I said, will he feel any pain, if we unhook the machine? Or I said, no. I said, there won't be any pain, there won't be nothing. I said, well, how long will he live? He said, maybe an hour, hour and a half. So I looked at Mom and I said, Mom, we got to do it. He wouldn't want to be here like this. So we went out and said, okay, bullet. And he lived about 5 minutes.
Mike called me from the Super Bowl. He got actually paged at the Super Bowl and heard it. And then he called me and I said, I'm coming home. He said, no, my dad wouldn't want you to do that. And I said, no, I'm coming home. He said, no, I want you to stay away. And I said, I want you to keep wrestling because that's what Dad would have wanted. So that's one of the things I regret in my life. I don't have many regrets, but I regret that I didn't go. But Mike insisted, and I don't know if it was also self-preservation for Mike, because at this time, Mike and I were so close, we were almost brothers. There was a love-hate relationship there. We would get in each other's throats and then be having a beer the next 10 minutes. But I always thought that if he saw me, we'd both break down, and he didn't want to do that.
And I kept saying, I said, I got to find his doctor. He had to have had something that was going to kill a cancer or something, But just 55 and depressed, and some business deals had embarrassed him. The wrestling business was changing, and there's nothing he could do about it. It just all consumed him at one time, and he just figured, shit on it, I'm out of here.
He had such a positive reputation in Florida that whatever he was caught up in was going to damage his reputation, and allegedly that was the reason why he took that route.
I don't think anybody has a definitive answer on that. There's all these rumors. Here's a guy that did everything on a handshake. He was a man's man. And people told him to stay away from this one group of people. and he invested with them in a big land deal. And I think there was some backdoor politicking. When he bought this land, they were going to put the extension, a loop around Tampa, and it wasn't where they bought this land, and they had done some wheeling and dealing, and I think it's like anybody else. People say, well, how can a guy lose $5 million or whatever? Because after a while, it's just zeros, you know what I mean? If you lose 100 and you only have 100, you've lost your life savings. If you got 5 million, you lose it, it's the same thing. I think he got over his head with bad people. I think he got depressed because of the losing the battle to Vince. I also think he felt that he wasn't relevant anymore with this new change, that he saw his friends panicking, not staying the course, and I think that's what happened. And who knows, but I think those were some factors that contributed to it.
Very, very sad day. When I heard it, how it happened.
When Eddie Graham passed away, lost an innovator, lost a motivator, and lost somebody that the visionary for this business that's needed.
We lost a pioneer. The business lost a pioneer when Eddie Graham was found dead, without question. But he touched the lives of a lot of guys, including me, and I never worked for him, that we'll always be grateful for.
Losing Eddie signaled, wow, this is a big change.
After the unexpected and tragic death of Eddie Graham, the Florida Territory continued under new guidance.
Florida suffered the last couple of years.
All the partners were arguing among themselves. And without a leader, nothing can survive, you know? When Dad was alive, what he said went. Nobody questioned it. Nobody did anything. Well, when he died, and there was 10 different people that owned a piece of the company, then they started butting heads with, oh, no, I don't want to run Jacksonville. I don't want to hire that guy. No, we can't pay that guy that much money. No, and it just started crumbling from within. And then Jimmy Crockett put the cake on the icing on the cake.
The Crockett's owned the Florida Territory at that time, but they didn't put much effort into it. And I don't know who sold what percentage of their partnerships or whatever, but Matsuda was no longer involved, Duke Kiyomoko was no longer involved, and they were running smaller towns and smaller venues.
Crockett did take over, that much we know, and it completely destroyed CWF. So Crockett took over, if I'm correct, somewhere around March of '87, and Gordon Soley was quickly gone. They stopped filming in the Sportatorium. They started filming at arenas and stuff like that. So the CWF as we knew it was basically over.
When he came in and said, oh yeah, we'll combine Carolina and Florida. Well, he was trying to figure out how to pay for the damn airplanes that he had bought. So instead of using, on a card with 15 guys, instead of using 12 from Florida and 2 or 3 guys off his Channel 17, he'd send the whole card and charge the office $400 a person transportation. So basically we were drawing money, but he was taking it all just to pay for his airplanes.
And they went from seeing all these superstars to nothing against the guys, but guys that had no exposure in Florida ever and sent down from the Crockett's, you know what I mean? And it just didn't work.
We gotta, they want the money, but we gotta pay our bills, whatever. I said, to hell with him. Put the money in the bank. I said, we can't go on paying his airplane costs. We've got guys that wrestle and live here. He's leaving all of our guys at home, and they're starving, flying people in, paying them huge money, and charging us for the airfare for all of them. That's done. We ain't doing it anymore. So that really was the icing on the cake. Jimmy Crockett bankrupted Championship Wrestling from Florida.
Literally, Within 4 or 5 months of that, CWF was completely absorbed and it was over with.
He had already taken all the talent. You know, if he didn't want to send Dusty, or if he didn't want to send Magnum, or he didn't want to send somebody off Channel 17, I mean, we weren't going to draw. And then when I said, no, we're not sending you more money, we're not using out of an 18-man roster, 16 of your guys. That math does not work. It isn't going to make it. And so then he says, well, then we'll sever our relationship, and you do what you want to do, and I'll do what I want to do.
Championship Wrestling from Florida ceased to exist. It reformed under Florida Championship Wrestling and soon renamed a Pro Wrestling Federation with the return of Dusty Rhodes. The PWF hoped to bring back the old Florida territory.
And I remember telling Stan that, you know, I'm thinking about just walking away from the business. And the reason is I was getting burnt out a little bit. I think my burnout was I was starting to feel some of the damage to my body. And I didn't want to drag my family around the country anymore. I'm from a military family. When I was a little kid, we moved every 2 years, my dad being in the Air Force. I was always a brand new kid in school. And what I didn't want to do to my children is make them the brand new kid in school every couple years when I had to move from one territory to the other. So I told Stan, I said, you know what, I'm settling down here in Tampa. I'm just going to stay here and work the territory. And that's when we started it after the Crockett's left out. And me and Dusty and Gordon Soley and Mike Graham took over and established a new territory, and Stan went on.
Turner had bought Crockett out. And anytime a corporate company comes in, they bring corporate mentality, not knowing anything about the industry at all, except it did numbers. We had moved to Dallas at the time, and in Dallas we had set up office. Jim Crockett came to me one day and he said, they don't want you to book anymore. Corporate, Jim Hurd and these guys that they hired. And but they want to talk to you about talent, you know, working. Well, I thought I was fucking, you know, I thought I was the king of Sheba at that fucking time. I can't, you know, fuck them. And Jim Hurd, my attorney, met with him. Now we're in attorneys, which I never had at this time, and all this stuff. And said we want him to be a heel. And we give him this much money in percentage of this town or whatever. Which was good. But I said, fuck him. I said, the American dream is, I'm not going to do that. I actually said that. And we turned it down. So I said, that's cool, now what am I going to do?
When Ted Turner bought Jim Crockett Promotions, he made a power play, and he lost, and you know, with Ric Flair, and he lost. They wanted Ric Flair, simply, and so he came back to Florida, and you know, it hadn't been that many years ago where Dusty Rhodes was a king in Florida, and was, you know, the top star, and you know, still had his ability to talk, still could wrestle. And had been on national television with, you know, on TBS all those years. And so the idea was go back to the old Florida Championship Wrestling days with Dusty Rhodes. And they had Gordon, the Key, they had Dusty Rhodes, and they had Gordon Soley on commentary.
Florida Championship Wrestling was dear to my heart. Was in barely afloat with the Nasty Boys and Michael and Steve Kern and Mike Graham, one of my closest friends out of the 5 that I have probably. And I went down there and spent 140, 50 grand, lost it.
I was excited when PWF came out, and I can tell you I didn't know about it, and then one day I turned on TV and there's Terry Funk dragging Dustin Rhodes into like the back of a pickup, and I was like, and Gordon Soley's there, and I'm like, what am I watching? This is awesome.
You couldn't go back. As cool as the old days were, and even with some of the same people, there was just a different landscape, and there was Hulk Hogan, there was Ric Flair, and going national, and so and Dusty, everybody, you know, Dusty was kind of burned out as an act by then.
Here he was on top on TBS, and then he's working his ass off to try and sell out an 800-seat building. Dusty was a 20,000, 10,000, 8,000 seat guy. 800 seats, he felt like he was doing something wrong, and I think that's why it didn't last so long.
Cable television was so strong that once Channel 17 got a hold of everybody. If you didn't have stars from Channel 17, you just didn't draw. And then when USA also came along nationwide and you didn't have stars from USA, you just didn't draw. So all of a sudden Dusty became the people had been used to seeing Dusty on Channel 17, on USA. Well, now all of a sudden he wasn't even on TV anymore. But he was coming to your town to wrestle tonight. No, you didn't think he was a star, you wasn't going to go. Just the name Dusty Rhodes wasn't compelling enough to get people to come out and go to the wrestling matches because they couldn't see him doing anything on TV. They couldn't see interviews on TV. They weren't, oh yeah, I'm gonna go see the Dream Whip so-and-so or whatever. So that was a fast, fleeting moment in Dusty's life where he tried to run Florida. He tried to come home because he thought that was the best place he'd have a foothold in, but he had been gone too long.
It was, for me, it was a big letdown. But we drew enough of the crowd, enough of a crowd because of, I guess, what we had done before, that we made an all right living. But it was nothing like it was because we killed it. And to go back and say we can revamp it, we can redo it, was one of the biggest mistakes Dusty ever made because Dusty lost almost all of his money trying to rebuild that.
There was a couple of shows I went to in the Miami area, and these shows drew like 900 with Dusty Rhodes on top, and it just said, it's over. Sadly, this is over.
When it started going pretty good, he didn't have the backing that he needed to get a territory going. And right after that, he told me he was going to WWF.
Florida territory that we had put together down there was losing its momentum. The WWF was pulling guys out of there left and right. I mean, it started with Tugboat, the Nasty Boys, some of the guys, Scott Hall, some of the guys that we were developing down there and trying to get going, we were slowly losing them. And then Dusty went, and once that happened, it started kind of coming apart and unraveling, and there was no funding. I mean, none of us had a ton of money saved up to keep it going.
With Dusty leaving for the WWF, it ended an era of territorial wrestling in the state of Florida, leaving behind moments and memories that live within us all who experienced what they called the greatest wrestling territory of all times, championship wrestling from Florida.
Florida had an aura about it.
It was built around credibility.
It was good. It was damn good. The wrestling they had the top wrestlers. They had some great talent.
There was nothing like championship wrestling from Florida. Nothing. It was hands down the greatest territory that any of the greats had ever passed through.
Championship wrestling from Florida back during that year was as good as any place in the whole United States.
It made and developed a whole bunch of champions in a whole big part of the world.
It was just something so special about Florida Championship Wrestling.
If you were from Florida, it was yours. If you weren't from Florida, it was someplace you wanted to go.
The legacy that Eddie Graham left behind is the history of the National Wrestling Alliance, the strength of the National Wrestling Alliance, the strength of championship wrestling from Florida.
They were ahead of their time. They had talent that could go with anybody. They could have talent that was interchangeable from the opening match to the main event.
Florida was the territory to be in, not New York, Florida. You had 12 months of sunshine.
Just because of Eddie Graham, because every great professional wrestler came through Florida. We just had the gift of sunshine and pretty beaches and water and an area that people wanted to come to anyway. And then Dad always took advantage of that opportunity to have great wrestlers and good competition and Du Bois ranches and just everything that he did, That's why it will forever be remembered.
This is Gennard Soley for my dad, Gordon Soley. So long from the Sunshine State.